The air in the crawl space beneath the cabin was thick with the scent of damp earth and life, a smell so profoundly out of place in the bitter Montana February of 1859 that it felt like a miracle. 11-year-old Caleb James Whitmore knelt on the packed soil, his small body trembling not from the cold, but from an emotion he had suppressed for 6 long months. He clutched his infant brother, Samuel, to his chest, the baby's warmth a fragile anchor in the darkness. Tears streamed down his chapped cheeks, catching the weak slanted light from the panes of glass above. Before him, dozens of tiny, vibrant green shoots of lettuce and spinach had broken through the rich, dark compost, a defiant army of green against a world of white. He wasn't crying from sorrow or fear, but from a wave of overwhelming relief so powerful it threatened to shatter his bones. This was more than food. It was a promise whispered from the grave, a testament that they might just survive. This single moment of release is the heart of a story about resilience in the face of impossible odds. If you feel the weight of this scene and believe in the power of human endurance, please take a moment to leave a like on this story. We would also love to know where in the world you are listening from, so feel free to share your city or country in the comments below. Your engagement helps these narratives find the audience they deserve, and I assure you understanding the journey that brought this young boy to his knees in a hidden, subterranean garden is an experience that will stay with you long after the story ends. Joining our community by subscribing ensures you won't miss powerful stories like Caleb's, which remind us of the quiet strength that can flourish even in the harshest of winters. But to truly understand why the sight of simple seedlings could break an orphaned boy who had become a fortress of stoicism, we must travel back in time. This story does not begin with life, but with loss. It begins 6 months earlier, in the bleakness of the previous autumn, on the day the typhoid fever that had scourged the territory finally claimed its last victim in the Whitmore family. That was the day Caleb's father, Thomas, drew his final breath, leaving his 11-year-old son utterly alone in an isolated cabin with a 9-month-old baby to protect, and a world that had already forgotten they existed. From that moment on, survival became a silent, desperate war waged against starvation, the encroaching cold and the far more terrifying threat of a man who promised salvation but delivered only despair. The world for Caleb James Whitmore had shrunk to the 4 log walls of the cabin his father had built with his own hands. In the autumn of 1858, following the quiet passing of his father, the silence that fell over their small clearing in the Montana wilderness was absolute and suffocating. It was a silence that amplified every sound, the frantic beat of his own heart, the whisper of the wind through the pines, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the infant sleeping in a makeshift cradle by the hearth. At 11 years old, Caleb was no longer a boy. Childhood had been a luxury, and it had been buried alongside his father in the cold, hard ground behind the cabin. Now he was a guardian, a provider, a protector. Every waking moment was governed by a single, crushing weight of responsibility for the tiny, fragile life that depended entirely on him. He moved through the cavernous space of the home with a grim purpose, his face set in a stoic mask that concealed the terror churning within. He learned to measure time not by the sun but by his brother's needs. Samuel, at just 9 months old, was a universe of vulnerability and innocence. His gurgles and soft cries were the only sounds that broke the oppressive quiet, reminding Caleb that he was not entirely alone. Holding Samuel was the only time the gnawing cold in his own chest seemed to recede. The baby's warmth was a tangible, living thing, a small furnace of life against the encroaching chill of the world. Caleb would swaddle him in layers of their mother's old wool blankets, his small chapped hands fumbling but gentle. He saw his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin in Samuel's face, a heartbreaking collage of everything he had lost. This tiny being was not a burden. He was the last remnant of family, the only reason for Caleb to fight the overwhelming urge to simply lie down and let the winter take them both. The days bled into one another, each defined by a relentless cycle of brutal physical labor. Before the sun crested the mountains, Caleb was outside, his father's heavy axe feeling foreign and monstrous in his small hands. He would chop wood until his arms ached and his palms were raw, the sharp reports of the splitting logs echoing in the frozen air. He hauled buckets of snow to melt over the fire, a tedious process that yielded precious little water for drinking, cleaning, and mixing the last of their flour into a thin, tasteless gruel. He learned to bank the fire at night so the embers would last until morning, a skill his father had taught him that now felt like a sacred rite. His body, small and wiry, was constantly sore, a dull, persistent ache that served as a constant reminder of their precarious existence and the immense physical gap left by his father's absence. Hunger was a constant companion, a hollow ache in the pit of his stomach that sharpened his senses and clouded his thoughts. The larder, once stocked with smoked meats, dried beans, and preserves, was now a monument to their dwindling future. Caleb rationed their remaining food with the precision of a seasoned quartermaster, counting out dried apples and measuring flour by the spoonful. He would feed Samuel first, mashing a portion of their meager meal with a little water until it was soft enough for the baby to swallow. He often went to bed with his own stomach cramping from emptiness, lying awake in the darkness and doing the terrible arithmetic of survival. He calculated how many days the last slab of salted pork would last, how many more meals he could make from the remaining sack of cornmeal. The answer was always the same: not enough. Not nearly enough to last until the spring thaw. This isolation was both a blessing and a curse. The miles of dense, snow-covered forest that separated their cabin from the nearest settlement of Helena were a protective barrier, hiding them from the prying eyes of the world. But that same wilderness was an impassive, unforgiving jailer. There was no one to turn to for help, no neighbor to call upon in an emergency. The knowledge that they were utterly, completely on their own was a heavy stone in Caleb's heart. He remembered the occasional visits from other settlers when his father was alive, the shared stories and laughter that had briefly filled the cabin. Now, there was nothing. It felt as if he and Samuel had fallen off the edge of the map, two forgotten souls in a vast, indifferent landscape. The loneliness was a physical presence, as real and as chilling as the winter frost that crept across the window panes each morning. But the fear of starvation and the crushing loneliness were secondary to a far more specific and terrifying threat. It had a name, Mr. Cornelius Black, and it had a place: the St. Francis Orphanage in Helena. Caleb had heard the stories whispered among the adults at the trading post, tales of a place that was less a sanctuary and more a prison. Mr. Black was a man who saw children not as lives to be nurtured, but as assets to be managed. It was widely known that he made a practice of separating siblings the moment they passed through his doors, claiming it was easier to place them with new families. But the older boys, the ones strong enough to work, rarely found families. Instead, they were sent to the copper mines in the north, bound by contracts that were little more than indentured servitude, a fate from which few ever returned. The thought of the orphanage was a constant, waking nightmare for Caleb. It was the monster that lurked in the shadows of his mind, the source of the cold sweat that would wake him in the dead of night. Every creak of the cabin's floorboards, every snap of a twig outside, sent a jolt of pure terror through him. He would imagine Mr. Black's carriage appearing at the edge of the clearing, the man himself stepping out, his face a mask of false piety and bureaucratic authority. He envisioned the moment they would be discovered, the cold hands that would pry Samuel from his arms. The idea of his own fate in the mines was terrible, but it was the vision of his infant brother, alone and terrified in the sterile, unloving walls of the orphanage, that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed composure. This was a fear beyond all others, a horror so profound it fueled his desperate will to remain invisible. In his darkest moments, when the fear and hunger became almost unbearable, Caleb would cling to the memories of his father, Thomas. He would close his eyes and summon his father's voice, a low, steady baritone that had always made him feel safe. He remembered the feel of his father's calloused hand on his shoulder, the smell of sawdust and pine that always clung to his clothes. Thomas Whitmore had been a farmer from Tennessee, a man who understood the rhythms of the earth and the secrets of the soil. He had taught Caleb how to read the clouds, how to identify edible plants, how to listen to the language of the forest. He had been a man of quiet strength and deep knowledge, a man who believed that nature, for all its harshness, would always provide for those who knew how to ask. These memories were both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of the wisdom he now had to wield alone. The cabin itself was his father's final lesson. Every perfectly notched log, every tightly sealed seam, was a testament to Thomas's skill and foresight. He had built it to withstand the harshest Montana winters, a fortress against the elements. But now, without its master, the home felt hollow, its warmth a pale imitation of the life it once held. Caleb would run his hands over the tools his father had left behind, the worn handle of a saw, the heavy head of a hammer, and feel the weight of his inheritance. It was not money or land, but knowledge, the practical, hard-won wisdom of how to survive. Yet, as the days grew shorter and the food stores dwindled, he began to fear that this inheritance wouldn't be enough. His father had prepared him for the challenges of the wild, but he had never prepared him for the cruelty of men like Cornelius Black. The constant state of high alert began to wear on him. He became a creature of shadows, moving with a quiet, practiced stealth. He did his chores in the grey light of dawn and dusk, avoiding the bright midday sun that might catch the eye of a passing rider. The world outside his small clearing became a landscape of potential threats. The distant howl of a wolf was no longer just a sound of the wild. It was a cry that could draw unwanted attention. The sight of a plume of smoke from a distant chimney was not a sign of fellow humanity, but a reminder of the world that could, at any moment, descend upon them and tear them apart. He felt like a hunted animal, his senses perpetually strained, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal the end of their fragile independence. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the facade would crack. In the deep stillness of the night, while Samuel slept soundly in his cradle, Caleb would sit by the dying fire and allow the full weight of his situation to press down on him. He would look at his brother's peaceful face, the tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, and the stoic resolve would melt away, leaving behind a terrified 11-year-old boy. He was a child playing the part of an adult, and he was desperately afraid of failing. In these silent, lonely hours, he did not cry. He had not shed a single tear since his father's death. He believed that if he started, he would never be able to stop, that the grief and fear would consume him entirely, leaving nothing left to protect the one person who mattered. He understood, with a clarity that was terrifying for a boy his age, that no one was coming to save them. The world had moved on. The settlers in Helena were consumed with their own struggles for survival, bracing for the long, hard winter ahead. The Whitmores, tucked away in their isolated cabin, were out of sight and out of mind. There would be no sympathetic neighbor knocking on the door with a basket of food, no town magistrate checking to see if the orphaned boys were safe. They were utterly alone, suspended in a fragile bubble of existence that grew thinner with each passing day. This stark realization was not a cause for despair, but for a cold, hard resolve. If they were to survive, it would be through his efforts alone. The world had forgotten them, and that had to be their greatest strength. The abstract dread that had haunted Caleb's every waking moment finally took on a solid, terrifying form in the first week of December. The cold had deepened, settling over the valley like a shroud, and the snow was piled so high against the cabin walls that the lower half of the windows were completely obscured, casting the interior in a perpetual twilight. His dwindling supplies forced a trip to the trading post in Helena, a journey he now made with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He would bundle Samuel so thoroughly that only the baby's eyes were visible, strapping him to his chest and praying they wouldn't draw attention. But on this day, attention found him. It came not in the form of a menacing official, but in the worried eyes of the one person in the settlement who had ever shown him genuine kindness, a kindness that was about to deliver the most devastating news of his life. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson was the wife of the trading post manager, a woman with a quiet strength and a face etched with the hardships of frontier life, yet her eyes held a warmth that was rare in that cold, pragmatic town. While others saw Caleb as a problem to be solved or an object of pity, she saw a boy fighting an impossible battle. She would often slip an extra apple or a handful of dried beans into his sack, a small act of charity performed with a discretion that preserved his fragile pride. On that December morning, however, her usual gentle smile was gone. As Caleb paid for his meager purchase of flour and salt, she caught his eye with a look of such profound concern that a fresh wave of ice washed through his veins, colder than any winter wind. She motioned for him to wait, her movements subtle but urgent, indicating a small, cluttered storage room behind the main counter. He followed her into the cramped space, the air thick with the smell of canvas, leather, and dried herbs. Samuel stirred against his chest, sensing the sudden tension. Mrs. Peterson closed the door until only a thin crack of light remained, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was a low, strained whisper that barely carried over the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. She told him she had been in her husband's office earlier that morning, sorting through ledgers, when Mr. Cornelius Black had arrived for an unscheduled meeting with the town magistrate who had been visiting. The office walls were thin and she had not meant to eavesdrop, but their voices carried, and the subject of their conversation had frozen her where she stood. She had listened, horrified, as the director of the St. Francis Orphanage laid out his formal, legal plans for the Whitmore boys. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It was now a documented petition. Mrs. Peterson recounted the conversation with painstaking detail, her words painting a chilling picture of bureaucratic cruelty. Mr. Black had spoken to the magistrate in a tone of feigned civic duty, arguing that it was the town's moral and legal responsibility to intervene. He presented Caleb as a child struggling under an adult burden, claiming the isolated cabin was an unsafe environment for an infant. He spoke of neglect not as a possibility, but as an inevitability, using the impending harshness of the winter as his primary evidence. He was not asking for permission to investigate. He was formally requesting that the court declare Caleb an unfit guardian and grant the orphanage full and immediate custody of both him and his brother Samuel. The magistrate, a man more concerned with order and liability than with the nuances of a family's tragedy, had been receptive to Black's arguments. To him, the situation was a simple equation: 2 orphans, a brutal winter, and no adult supervision. The risk of them perishing alone was a potential stain on the town's reputation, a problem that Mr. Black was offering to solve neatly and officially. Mrs. Peterson explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear, that Black had masterfully framed his request as an act of charity, a necessary measure to save 2 lost souls from the wilderness. He had twisted Caleb's fierce independence into proof of his recklessness and his silent suffering into evidence of his inability to provide a safe and stable home for his infant brother. The most terrifying part of the news was the timeline. The magistrate, while sympathetic to Black's position, was a man who adhered to procedure. He would not grant the petition immediately. Instead, he had agreed to officially review the case in April, once the spring thaw made travel to the outlying homesteads possible again. He would send a deputy to the Whitmore cabin to assess the situation. And if he found the boys in the state of starvation and neglect that Black had described, the custody order would be executed without delay. The news landed on Caleb not as a reprieve, but as a death sentence with a 4-month fuse. The spring, which should have been a symbol of hope and survival, was now the deadline for his failure, the moment the world would officially descend to tear his family apart. As Mrs. Peterson finished speaking, the full weight of the information settled over Caleb. He finally understood the true nature of the trap he was in. He could not ask for help, for any plea for food or supplies would be seen as confirmation of Mr. Black's claims. He could not appear weak or desperate, as that would be used as evidence against him. He was being judged on his ability to achieve the impossible, to survive a Montana winter, alone, with a baby, on virtually nothing. The system was not designed to help him. It was designed to justify his failure. The law, which was supposed to protect the innocent, was being wielded as a weapon to take his brother away from him forever. The quiet, desperate war he had been waging in secret was about to have a final public battle he had no chance of winning. Mrs. Peterson looked at him, her eyes filled with a helpless sorrow. She knew, as he did, that there was no easy answer. She was risking her own family's standing in the community just by giving him this warning. She pressed a small, worn bag of dried corn into his hands, a gesture that felt both profoundly kind and tragically inadequate. She told him to be careful, to leave no reason for anyone to come checking on him before April. Her final words were a stark confirmation of his deepest fears. She said that Cornelius Black was a patient man, a man who saw children as figures on a ledger, and he was absolutely certain that the winter would win his case for him. He was not just waiting for Caleb to fail, he was counting on it. The walk back to the cabin was a blur of white snow and grey sky. The world had fundamentally changed in the span of a few minutes. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper the word, April. The silent, snow-laden pines no longer felt like a protective barrier, but like the walls of a prison whose warden was the calendar itself. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely felt it. A different kind of cold had taken root deep inside him, a cold forged from the certainty of his fate. He was no longer just fighting against hunger and the elements. He was now fighting against time, against the law, and against a man who had already declared him defeated. Back inside the relative warmth of the cabin, he unwrapped Samuel and held him close, looking down at the baby's trusting, peaceful face. The fear was still there, a sharp, metallic taste in the back of his throat, but it was now accompanied by something else, a cold, hard resolve that settled in his bones. The vague nightmare of the orphanage had been replaced by the concrete reality of a magistrate's review in 4 months. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that their current path led directly to Mr. Black's waiting carriage. Surviving day to day was no longer enough. Hiding was no longer enough. He had to do more than just endure the winter. He had to defeat it. That night, the cabin was no longer a shelter. It had transformed into a tomb with a ticking clock. The 4-month reprieve until April, which should have felt like a vast expanse of time, now seemed to shrink with every gust of wind that rattled the window frames. Each passing hour was a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass, bringing Mr. Black and his cold, legalistic charity one step closer. Caleb sat by the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls, making the small space feel both immense and claustrophobic. He held Samuel, whose steady, rhythmic breathing was a stark contrast to the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart. The warmth of his brother in his arms was the only thing that kept the encroaching despair from consuming him completely. He stared into the embers, seeing not warmth, but the final, dying glow of their life together, a future being systematically extinguished by a world that had deemed him inadequate. For a desperate, fleeting moment, his mind raced toward the only other option he could conceive: escape. He envisioned them leaving in the dead of night, a small bundle of supplies on his back, and Samuel strapped to his chest, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. He imagined them walking for days, seeking a different town, a different territory, a place where the name Whitmore meant nothing, and the shadow of Cornelius Black could not reach. But the fantasy crumbled as quickly as it formed, disintegrating under the harsh glare of reality. He saw them lost in a blizzard, their tracks covered by the ceaseless snow. He felt the gnawing hunger as their meager supplies ran out, the biting cold seeping through their clothes until it stilled their hearts. The wilderness was not a sanctuary. It was a faster, more certain executioner. Running was not a strategy for survival. It was a surrender to a different kind of death, one that would be just as final and would leave Samuel just as alone. Defeated, he let his head fall into his hands, the rough fabric of his trousers scratching against his forehead. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh from the sleeping infant. It was in that moment of absolute surrender, when all hope seemed to have been ground into dust, that a memory surfaced unbidden and crystal clear. It was his father's voice, not a faint echo but a living presence in the room, speaking as if he were standing right beside him. Thomas had been explaining the design of their chimney, his large, calloused hand pointing to where the stones met the log walls. "Heat always finds a way to escape, son," he had said, his voice a low, patient rumble. "It's the way of things. It rises, and it searches for a way out. A smart man doesn't try to stop it. A smart man learns to capture it." The words, once a simple lesson in construction, now resonated with the force of a divine revelation, a key turning a lock deep within Caleb's mind. He lifted his head, his eyes no longer fixed on the dying embers but looking through them, seeing something else entirely. He thought of the sun, how even on the coldest winter days, its pale light would fall upon the south-facing wall of the cabin, melting the frost on the window panes for a few precious hours. He thought of the earth itself, how his father had explained that just a few feet below the frozen surface, The ground held a steady, constant temperature, protected from the brutal air above, and he thought of the crawl space beneath their feet, a dark, forgotten void filled with nothing but damp soil and shadows. His father's lessons, scattered fragments of knowledge about soil composition, crop rotation, and the simple, powerful physics of light and warmth, began to coalesce. They were not just memories of a lost parent. They were tools, a blueprint for survival that had been left for him all along. The decision, when it finally solidified, was not born of frantic panic, but of a cold, clear, and desperate logic. He would not run from the winter. He would trap a piece of it and force it to serve him. He would not hide from the world. He would build a new one, a secret living world, right beneath the floorboards of the old one. He would create a garden in the heart of the frozen season. The idea was so audacious, so contrary to every law of nature and man in this brutal landscape, that it felt like a form of madness. Yet, it was the only path that did not lead directly to Cornelius Black's carriage. The terror of failure was immense, a towering wave that threatened to pull him under, but for the first time in months, it was overshadowed by the fierce, defiant power of a tangible plan. He would not be a passive victim waiting for his fate. He would become a creator, a farmer in the dark. His first move was to unearth their last resort. He pulled back the heavy bearskin rug near the hearth, his fingers finding the edges of the loose floorboard his father had shown him years ago. Prying it up, he reached into the dark, cold space beneath and felt the familiar chill of the tin box. It was a small, unassuming container, but inside lay their final inheritance, 8 carefully folded dollars, saved for a catastrophe his father could never have imagined. As Caleb's fingers brushed against the worn paper currency, he felt a profound and painful connection to the man who had placed it there. This was not just money. It was his father's last act of protection, a final provision for his sons. Spending it felt like a betrayal and a fulfillment all at once. This was the point of no return. Once this money was gone, they would have absolutely nothing left but the success or failure of his impossible idea. The next morning, with Samuel bundled against his chest, he made the trek back to Helena, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and deception. At the trading post, he avoided Mrs. Peterson's worried gaze, afraid that his newfound resolve might be visible on his face, a fragile secret she might unintentionally expose. He walked directly to the well-worn Sears and Roebuck catalogue, chained to the counter, its pages filled with promises from a world away. He flipped through the familiar sections, his eyes scanning past farming implements and winter clothing, until he found what he was looking for: window glass. He used a piece of charcoal to carefully write down the item number for 6 large panes, his hand steady despite the tremor of adrenaline in his veins. He knew this purchase would be questioned, that it made no sense for an orphan on the brink of starvation to be buying glass in the middle of winter. He would have to invent a story, a plausible lie about repairing windows before the spring storms, a fiction he rehearsed over and over in his head. Returning to the cabin, the heavy weight of his decision settled into a relentless, driving energy. The work had to begin immediately, and it had to be done in secret. The crawlspace was accessible through a small, rough-hewn trapdoor in the corner of the main room, a space he had never entered. He knew the digging would be the hardest part, and the noise would be the most dangerous. Any unusual sounds carrying on the still, cold air could attract unwanted attention from a passing hunter or neighbor. He began to plan his labor around the weather, waiting for the wind to rise and howl through the pines, its roar a natural cloak for the sounds of his scraping shovel and the thud of dirt being moved. He would work in the dim light of a single lantern, the darkness of the subterranean space swallowing the small glow, hiding his frantic efforts from the world above. Before he lifted the trapdoor for the first time, he paused. He took a long, deliberate look around the cabin, memorizing the way the faint afternoon light fell across the worn wooden table, the way Samuel's cradle sat perfectly in the warm pocket of air beside the hearth. He was saying a silent farewell, not to the physical place, but to the person he had been within its walls. The boy who had done nothing but endure, who had rationed and waited and prayed for a miracle, was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone defined not by what he had lost, but by what he was determined to build. He was confronting the terrifying possibility that his efforts would amount to nothing, that he was digging a grave instead of a garden. He accepted that risk, the cold weight of it settling in his gut, and turned his focus to the task at hand. He knelt down and laid a hand on Samuel's back as the baby slept. The soft, steady rhythm of his brother's breathing was the only metronome he needed. Every shovelful of dirt, every splinter in his hand, every aching muscle would be for this small, fragile life. The April deadline, once a symbol of his doom, was now a finish line. The magistrate and Cornelius Black believed they were waiting for the winter to break him, to starve him into submission. They were wrong. They were not waiting for him to fail. They were giving him just enough time to succeed. With a final, silent promise to the sleeping child, Caleb James Whitmore lifted the heavy wooden trapdoor, leaving the world of passive survival behind and descending into the darkness to begin his work. The physical act of this desperate flight began not with a sprint, but with a descent. The day after his decision, Caleb lifted the heavy trapdoor, revealing a square of profound blackness that smelled of cold, damp earth and forgotten things. A gust of frigid air, more cellar-chilled than the winter air above, rose to meet him, a stark greeting from the underbelly of his world. With Samuel secured in a sling on his back, the infant's warmth a small, precious furnace against the chill, he lowered himself down the rough-hewn ladder. His boots sank into the soft, yielding soil. In the wavering light of a single lantern, the space felt both impossibly small and terrifyingly vast. This was not an escape into the open wilderness, but a retreat into the earth itself, a burrowing action driven by the primal need to hide his fragile hope from the prying eyes of the world and the unforgiving sky. The weight of the 3 weeks ahead, a timeline that felt both eternal and terrifyingly short, pressed down on him with the physical force of the cabin above. The first week was a brutal, monotonous war against the frozen ground. Armed with his father's short-handled shovel, Caleb began to dig. Each shovelful of the dense, clay-like soil was a monumental effort for his 11-year-old frame, a jarring shock that traveled up his arms and settled as a deep ache in his shoulders and back. He worked in a frantic, rhythmic silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal against dirt and the grunts of his own exertion. He learned to time his labor with the weather, digging furiously whenever the Montana wind howled through the pines, its mournful roar a perfect camouflage for his subterranean activities. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the small, golden pool of his lantern light, which cast his own shadow as a hulking, monstrous companion. By the end of each day, his body screamed with a fatigue so profound it felt like an illness, and his hands, despite his father's worn leather gloves, were already rubbed raw and blistered. His next task was to enrich the dead earth he had excavated. He made trip after agonizing trip to the abandoned livestock pen behind the cabin, a place he hadn't gone near since his father's passing. There, beneath a hard crust of snow, lay a thick, deep layer of composted manure, a legacy of the animals they no longer had. The smell was overwhelming, a potent, earthy aroma of decay that was strangely, powerfully alive. He filled bucket after bucket, his small body straining under the weight, and hauled it back to the crawl space. Down in the cold dark, he mixed the rich, dark compost with the excavated soil, his bare hands plunging into the freezing mixture. He worked by feel, remembering his father's lessons on soil composition, the words a ghostly instruction in his mind. The cold was a physical pain, seeping into his bones until his fingers were numb, clumsy things that barely felt like his own. A moment of near catastrophe struck midway through the second week. As he was prying a particularly stubborn rock from the wall of his deepening pit, the aged wooden handle of his father's shovel cracked under the strain. The sharp sound echoed in the confined space, as loud as a gunshot to his frayed nerves. He stared at the splintered wood in his hands, and for a terrifying moment his resolve crumbled. The broken tool felt like a final, damning omen, a sign from the universe that his plan was foolish, that he was destined to fail. Despair, cold and numbing, washed over him, but then, looking at the sleeping form of Samuel, he refused to surrender. He retrieved a roll of leather strapping from his father's tool chest, and with trembling, frozen fingers, spent a precious hour binding the handle, reinforcing it until it was stronger than before. It was a small, clumsy repair, but it felt like a monumental victory against the encroaching darkness. His secret labors were not entirely unnoticed. Frank Hutchins, the area's most prosperous and arrogant rancher, made it a habit to ride the perimeter of his vast property. On one bitterly cold afternoon, he spotted Caleb hauling a bucket from the old pen. Hutchins reined in his horse, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. He shouted to his companions, his voice carrying with perfect clarity on the still, frigid air, that the Whitmore orphan had finally gone mad from hunger. He declared Caleb was trying to grow crops in the heart of a Montana winter, a pronouncement that was met with loud, booming laughter from the other men. The sound was a physical blow, each burst of ridicule a stone thrown at his fragile hope. Caleb kept his head down, his face burning with a mixture of shame and white-hot anger, and continued his work. Their scorn did not break him. It forged his determination into something harder, colder, and utterly unbreakable. The focus of his labor then shifted from brute force to careful precision. He began constructing the wooden frames that would hold the 6 precious panes of glass. He used the last of his father's milled lumber, measuring and sawing each piece with a focus that bordered on obsession. Every cut had to be perfect, every joint snug. The work was slow and painstaking, a different kind of exhaustion from the relentless digging. Splinters worked their way deep into his raw, chapped hands, a constant stinging reminder of his inexperience. He would work until the lantern light grew dim and his eyes blurred with fatigue, his mind consumed with angles and measurements. He was no longer just a boy digging in the dirt. He was a carpenter, an engineer, a creator, channeling the ghost of his father's practical knowledge into every nail he hammered home. The weather itself became a relentless adversary. A severe cold snap descended upon the valley, bringing with it temperatures that were dangerous, even for the most seasoned frontiersman. The air grew so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, and his breath froze in crystalline clouds before his face. Working in the crawlspace offered little protection. The chill seemed to radiate from the very earth, a permanent, seeping cold that no amount of labor could warm. He was forced to take frequent breaks, scrambling back up into the cabin to huddle by the hearth, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as he tried to force feeling back into his numb fingers and toes. Each trip back down into the frigid darkness was an act of supreme will, a battle against his body's desperate instinct to seek warmth and safety, to simply give up and stay by the fire. The most heart-stopping moments came when he handled the glass. The 6 large panes, purchased with his father's last dollars, were the linchpin of his entire plan. They were impossibly fragile, a thin barrier of civilization in this brutal wilderness. Carrying the first pane to the edge of the crawlspace, his hands clumsy and stiff with cold, he felt a tremor of pure terror. The glass was heavy and slick with condensation. As he began to lower it into the darkness, it slipped from his icy grip. For a fraction of a second, it hung in the air. He lunged, his body reacting before his mind could process the horror, and caught the edge just before it could fall and shatter on the frozen ground below. The jolt of adrenaline was so powerful it left him dizzy and nauseous, his heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned against the cabin wall, gasping for breath, profoundly aware of how his entire future rested on these fragile sheets of manufactured light. A profound sense of relief, the first he had felt in weeks, washed over him when the first frame and its pane of glass were successfully installed. He had angled it perfectly on the south-facing side of the cabin, just as his father had taught him, to catch the maximum amount of the weak winter sun. From inside the deepened crawlspace, he looked up through the glass. The familiar, oppressive grey sky appeared different from this new perspective. Its light filtered and softened, contained. It was a window to a world he was trying to hold at bay, but it was also a promise, a tangible piece of his plan made real. He ran a hand over the cold, smooth surface, a small shield against the vast, indifferent wilderness. It was the first piece of the wall he was building around their future, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe it might actually hold. The final week of construction was a frantic, desperate blur. The work became an all-consuming rhythm of hauling, cutting, and fitting. He operated almost entirely on instinct, his mind and body synchronized in a single desperate purpose. The approaching April deadline was a constant, silent drumbeat in his head, pushing him forward. He ate what little was left of their food without tasting it, his stomach a tight knot of anxiety. He barely slept, his nights filled with fitful dreams of shattering glass and the sound of Cornelius Black's laughter. He grew thinner, his face gaunt and smudged with dirt, his eyes wide and haunted in the lantern light. He was a small, solitary ghost, moving between the world above and the world below, his existence defined entirely by the secret garden he was trying to will into being through sheer force of effort. The community's judgment remained a constant, oppressive presence. His rare trips to the trading post were met with a mixture of pity and scorn. The story of the mad Whitmore orphan had spread, and now the whispers followed him through the town. He saw the settlers pointing at him, their expressions a cold confirmation of his isolation. They saw a boy courting disaster, wasting his energy on a fool's errand when he should have been begging for help, for charity, for the intervention of men like Mr. Black. He learned to avoid their gazes, to make himself as small and invisible as possible, his project a secret he guarded with a fierce protective silence. Their disbelief became another layer of insulation, another wall between his world and theirs, hardening his resolve to prove them all wrong. Finally, after 3 weeks of relentless, back-breaking labor, it was done. The last pane of glass was set into its frame. The last shovelful of rich, dark soil was spread evenly across the raised beds. He stood in the center of the completed subterranean greenhouse, his body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. The air was still and cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and manure, the scent of potential. The space was no longer just a crawl space. It was a sanctuary, a hidden chamber of hope. The physical part of his desperate flight was over. He had built the refuge. He had prepared the ground. He had done everything that strength and will could accomplish. The final act was one of quiet, profound faith. He retrieved the small, worn tin box that held his family's seeds, the last remnants of his father's dream of a farm in this new territory. He opened the small paper packets with hands that trembled from exhaustion and cold. Lettuce, spinach, radishes, carrots. The seeds were so small, so impossibly insignificant against the scale of the winter raging outside. Kneeling in the dark soil, he pushed each tiny seed into the cold ground with the tip of his finger. It was not a farmer's confident planting. It was a desperate prayer, a final, whispered plea to the memory of his father and to the unfeeling earth. Each seed was a question mark, a tiny vessel carrying the entire weight of their survival. With the last seed planted, he climbed the ladder for the final time and pulled the heavy trapdoor shut, sealing his secret garden in complete darkness. The click of the latch settling into place echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the cabin. His frantic, desperate movement had come to an end, replaced by a terrible, agonizing stillness. He had built his ark, but he had no way of knowing if it would float. He had escaped into the earth, but he did not know if it would be a womb or a tomb. He had done everything he could. The rest was up to the sun, the seeds, and the ghost of his father's love. Now, all he and Samuel could do was wait. The weeks that followed the planting were a slow, agonizing descent into true hopelessness. By the middle of February, the last of the salted pork was gone, and the flour sack held nothing but a fine, dusty residue. The winter, far from releasing its grip, seemed to tighten it, unleashing a series of blizzards that buried the cabin in a silent, suffocating blanket of white. Caleb grew gaunt, his movements slow and deliberate to conserve what little energy he had left. The defiant hope that had fueled his frantic labor had withered, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty of failure. He had gambled everything on his father's knowledge, and he had lost. On a bitterly cold morning, with the silence of the cabin pressing in on him, he decided to look one last time. It was not a search for a miracle, but an act of surrender, a need to face the barren, frozen soil of his failure before the end finally came. He moved Samuel from the cradle, wrapping the now unsettlingly light infant in another layer of blankets and securing him in the sling on his chest. The baby's warmth was a faint, fragile reminder of what was at stake. He crossed the room, his worn boots making no sound on the wooden floor, and knelt before the trapdoor. His hands, chapped and raw, hesitated over the iron ring. Part of him didn't want to open it, preferring to let the failure remain a possibility rather than confirming it as a cold, hard fact. He was terrified of the empty, dead space that awaited him below, a subterranean tomb for his last desperate hope. He took a shallow, ragged breath, the frigid air stinging his lungs, and with a grunt of effort that seemed to drain his last reserve of strength, he pulled the heavy door open, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A current of air rose to meet him, and it was the first thing that felt wrong. It was cold, yes, but it was not the sterile, biting cold of the world above. This air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something profoundly out of place in the dead of a Montana winter. It was a smell he associated with spring thaws and muddy fields, a rich, loamy aroma that carried a faint, almost imperceptible undertone of life. It was so unexpected that it confused him, his exhausted mind struggling to process the sensory contradiction. He dismissed it as a trick of his imagination, a phantom scent conjured by hunger and desperation, and began his careful descent down the rough-hewn ladder, his body bracing for the crushing disappointment he knew was waiting for him in the dark. Once his feet touched the soft soil, he fumbled for the lantern and the flint and steel. His hands were clumsy with cold, and it took several tries before a spark caught the wick. A small golden flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness in a slow, hesitant wave. The light illuminated the space he had carved from the earth, revealing the raised beds of dark, rich soil, the neatly constructed wooden frames, the faint sheen of condensation on the underside of the glass panes above. Everything appeared exactly as he had left it weeks ago. He saw no change, no sign of life, only the cold, still dirt. A wave of profound, soul-crushing defeat washed over him. The strange smell had been a lie, a final, cruel trick played by his own desperate mind. It was over. He had failed them. He took a step forward, the lantern held low, its light skittering across the surface of the raised beds. He felt a grim compulsion to inspect the barren soil up close, to witness the full extent of his folly. The weak, slanted light from the glass panes above did little to illuminate the space, merely turning the absolute blackness into a landscape of deep, shifting shadows. He moved slowly, his heart a heavy, cold stone in his chest, his breath catching in his throat as he prepared to face the undeniable evidence that nature had rejected his desperate plea. He was no longer looking for a miracle. He was simply performing the final, painful ritual of accepting his fate, of acknowledging the victory of the winter and the coming triumph of Mr. Cornelius Black. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of color in the lantern light, something his eyes, accustomed to the monochrome world of snow and shadow, almost failed to register. He stopped, holding the lantern perfectly still. It wasn't a trick of the light. There, pushing defiantly through the dark compost, was a tiny, perfectly formed set of leaves, a splash of vibrant, impossible green. He stared, his mind refusing to believe what he was seeing. He took another step, lowering the light, and saw another, and then another. Dozens of them. Tiny, fragile shoots of lettuce and spinach had broken through the soil, a silent, defiant army of life massing in the darkness. They were real, they were alive. He blinked, expecting them to vanish, but they remained, a testament to a power he had only dared to hope for. A sound escaped his throat, a choked, ragged gasp that was half sob, half cry of disbelief. The sight was so overwhelming, so fundamentally contrary to the frozen reality of his world, that his mind struggled to contain it. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just above one of the tiny plants, afraid that his touch might shatter the beautiful, fragile illusion. But it was no illusion. He could see the delicate veins in the leaves, the faint shimmer of moisture on their surfaces. This was not just life. It was sustenance. It was survival. It was the future, a future he had believed was lost forever, now sprouting from the cold, dark earth right before his eyes. The fortress of stoicism he had built around his heart for 6 long months began to crumble, the first cracks appearing in a wall that had withstood starvation, loneliness, and fear. He dropped to his knees, the lantern tipping onto its side, its light now casting a long, dramatic sweep across the miraculous scene. He clutched his brother, burying his face in Samuel's warm blankets, and the dam finally broke. The tears he had refused to shed since the day his father died came in a single shattering wave, a torrent of grief, terror, and a relief so profound it felt like physical pain. His small body was racked with sobs. the sounds echoing in the close, sacred space of his hidden garden. He wasn't crying from sorrow. He was crying because the weight of the world, the crushing, impossible burden of keeping them both alive, had suddenly, miraculously been lifted. He was crying because he finally understood that he was not, and had never been, truly alone in his fight. These were not just seedlings, they were a message sent from beyond the grave. This was his father's love made manifest, a legacy not of money or land, but of knowledge, a quiet wisdom powerful enough to defy a Montana winter and protect his family. Every lesson about the sun, every instruction on the richness of the soil, had been a seed planted in his own mind, seeds that had now borne the most precious fruit imaginable. As he knelt on the damp earth, holding the future of his family in his arms, Caleb James Whitmore wept for the father he had lost, for the brother he had saved, and for the simple, beautiful, and undeniable truth that even in the deepest, coldest darkness, life and love would always find a way to grow. The tears that streamed down Caleb's face were a warm, cleansing river, washing away 6 months of stoic resolve and silent terror. He knelt in the dirt, the solid weight of Samuel against his chest, and allowed the sobs to shake his entire body, each one a release of a burden he hadn't realized he was still carrying. It was the sound of a boy finally breaking, not from despair, but from the unbearable weight of a miracle. The vibrant green shoots before him were more than just food. They were an answer to a prayer he had been too afraid to speak aloud. They were a defiant shout of life in a world that had been silenced by death and winter. In that subterranean sanctuary, surrounded by the scent of living earth, Caleb cried for the first time as a guardian, not as a victim, his tears watering the very soil that had just saved them. This was the end of his silent war, a surrender not to defeat but to an overwhelming, impossible victory. As the first wave of catharsis subsided, leaving him feeling hollowed out and strangely peaceful, his gaze fell upon the small, weathered tool crate he had brought down weeks ago. It was his father's, filled with the simple, practical instruments of a man who built his world with his own 2 hands. He had used the tools without much thought, driven by the frantic energy of his project. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his emotional release, he felt a pull toward it. He shifted Samuel slightly and crawled over, his fingers tracing the familiar worn grain of the pine box. He lifted the lid, the faint scent of oil and sawdust, his father's scent, rising to meet him. Inside, nestled amongst the hammers and files, was the small tin box that had once held their seeds. He had emptied it, but something had prompted him to keep it here, a silent monument to the gamble he had taken. He picked up the tin, its surface cold against his skin. He ran his thumb over the faded lettering, his mind replaying the moment he had pushed the last of the seeds into the cold earth. It felt like a lifetime ago. He opened the lid, expecting nothing but the faint residue of dust and hope. Instead, his eyes caught on something that had been stuck to the bottom, hidden beneath the last of the seed packets. It was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased with age. His heart began to pound a new, different rhythm, one of curiosity and a dawning, incredible suspicion. With trembling fingers he carefully unfolded the paper. It was not a letter, but a rough, hand-drawn diagram, sketched in charcoal. It showed the foundation of a cabin, a deepened crawlspace and angled lines representing panes of glass, capturing the arc of the low winter sun. Beneath the simple, powerful drawing were his father's words, written in a steady, familiar script that Caleb had not seen since before the fever. There were only 8 of them, but they struck him with the force of a physical blow, rearranging his entire understanding of the past 6 months. The note read, "For my boys, the sun will always find you." He stared at the words, reading them again and again, the charcoal letters blurring through a fresh wave of tears. This was not his idea. This was not his desperate, clever invention born of fear. This was a plan, a final gift. A legacy left for him not in words of advice spoken by a fireside, but in a quiet, practical blueprint for survival, tucked away for him to find when he needed it most. He had not been stumbling in the dark. He had been following a map his father had drawn for him. He finally understood. The seemingly random lessons about soil, the offhand comments about the sun's path in winter. The insistence on building the cabin on this specific south-facing slope, none of it had been random. Thomas Whitmore, facing his own mortality, had spent his last days not just preparing his son for life, but preparing a very specific path through the impossible trial he knew was coming. He had foreseen the isolation, the hunger, the brutal winter. He had seen the shadow of men like Cornelius Black, and he had built this, a secret weapon, a final act of protection forged from knowledge, love, and the unshakable belief that his sons deserved to live. The garden was not a miracle of nature, it was a miracle of a father's foresight, a love so powerful it had reached across the veil of death to provide for his children. The scorn of the other settlers, the mocking laughter of Frank Hutchkins, all of it evaporated into insignificance. He had not been a mad orphan digging in the frozen dirt. He had been a son carrying out his father's last will and testament. The shame that had burned in his cheeks was replaced by a fierce, quiet pride that settled deep in his bones. He was not just a survivor. He was the keeper of his father's wisdom, the executor of a plan so profoundly loving and intelligent that the rest of the world couldn't even comprehend it. He looked from the note in his hand to the green shoots in the soil, and he saw the direct, unbroken line between his father's love and their survival. He was not alone. He had never been alone. His father had been with him in every shovelful of dirt, in every nail he hammered, guiding his hands from a place beyond his sight. He carefully refolded the precious note and placed it back in the tin box, closing the lid with a sense of reverence. This small, dented container was now the most sacred object he owned. It held not just seeds, but the very essence of his father's soul. He looked at Samuel, who was stirring now, his small eyes blinking in the lantern light. Caleb felt a profound shift inside him. The terror of the future, the constant gnawing fear of Mr. Black and the April deadline, had receded. It was still a threat, but it no longer felt like an inevitability. His father had given them more than a garden. He had given them proof. He had armed them with undeniable evidence of their right to exist, to remain a family. The winter was no longer their enemy. It was their accomplice. Holding his brother close, Caleb whispered a promise into the quiet, sacred air of the greenhouse, a promise directed at the memory of the man who had built this sanctuary for them. He promised to protect Samuel, not just from the cold or from hunger, but from a world that would try to tear them apart. He promised to honor the legacy of knowledge he had been given, to never forget that love was not just a feeling, but an action, a plan, a garden grown in the dark. He would face the magistrate in April, not as a desperate, starving orphan, but as a provider, a protector, the son of Thomas Whitmore. And he would win. His father had already ensured it. The arrival of April brought with it the spring thaw, but for the rest of Helena, it brought a new kind of winter. The town's food reserves were gone, depleted by the long, harsh season. Scurvy, the slow, insidious disease of malnutrition, began to creep through the settlement, claiming two of the older residents. Families like Frank Hutchkins, who had once laughed at Caleb's efforts, were now reduced to boiling leather boots for a thin, tasteless broth. The laughter had long since died in their throats, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of starvation. While the town withered, Caleb and Samuel thrived. Every day Caleb would descend into his hidden garden and harvest crisp, vibrant lettuce, plump, spicy radishes, and handfuls of dark green spinach, his father's legacy, providing a bounty that seemed to defy all logic and reason. It was Mrs. Eleanor Peterson who became the bridge between Caleb's secret world and the suffering town. Worried sick, she had saved a small bag of flour and made the difficult trek to the Whitmore cabin, expecting to find the worst. Instead, she found Caleb, thin but healthy, and Samuel, alert and well-fed. When he saw the genuine, desperate concern in her eyes, he made a choice. He led her to the trapdoor and, with a quiet solemnity, revealed the miracle beneath their feet. Mrs. Peterson stared at the rows of lush green life, her hand covering her mouth in stunned silence. She saw not just a garden, but the irrefutable proof of a boy's love and a father's wisdom. She returned the next day, not alone but with Catherine Holloway, a traveling lawyer from Bozeman who had been stranded in Helena by the late storms. Catherine Holloway was a woman who understood that the law could be both a shield and a sword. When she saw the subterranean greenhouse, she saw more than just a clever survival strategy. She saw evidence. She saw the foundation of a legal argument that would not just protect Caleb, but dismantle the very system that threatened him. The garden was the perfect, undeniable rebuttal to Cornelius Black's petition. It was living proof that Caleb was not just a capable guardian, but an extraordinary one, a provider who had succeeded where an entire community had failed. The narrative of the neglected orphan was shattered, replaced by the reality of a resilient, resourceful young man who had found a way to make the earth yield its bounty in the most impossible of circumstances. Fueled by a righteous indignation, Catherine Holloway's investigation began. The stark contrast between Caleb's private abundance and the town's public suffering was the catalyst. Using town records, financial ledgers from the trading post, and the hushed, fearful testimonies of other families who had lost children to the St. Francis orphanage, she methodically uncovered the horrifying truth. Mr. Black was not a savior of children. He was a merchant of them. He was operating a sophisticated and monstrous child trafficking ring, selling the town's orphaned and unwanted boys as indentured servants to the brutal copper mines in the north. His petition against Caleb had never been about charity. It had been an attempt to acquire new assets for his cruel enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming. Federal marshals summoned by Holloway arrested Cornelius Black in his office, his facade of piety crumbling to reveal the cold, calculating monster beneath. The raid on the northern mining camps that followed resulted in the rescue of 27 boys, emaciated and broken, but alive. The town of Helena was rocked by the scandal, its collective guilt a heavy shroud. The men who had laughed at Caleb, who had scorned his efforts, now stood in silent, shamed awe of the boy who had not only saved himself, but had inadvertently exposed a rot at the heart of their community. His quiet act of defiance had brought down a tyrant and freed those who had been forgotten. That summer, a new chapter began for the Whitmore boys. Dr. William and Martha Collins, a kind and respected couple who had lost their own son to diphtheria years earlier, saw in Caleb and Samuel a chance to rebuild a family. They legally adopted both boys, and the cavernous, lonely cabin was finally filled with the warmth and security Caleb had only dreamed of. With the Collinses' support and resources, Caleb established the Thomas Whitmore Foundation for Agriculture and Child Protection, ensuring his father's name was tied not to tragedy, but to resilience and hope. 4 years later, at the age of 15, Caleb was no longer a scorned orphan. He was an itinerant instructor, a young man with a quiet confidence and his father's knowledgeable eyes, traveling across 5 territories. He taught other vulnerable, isolated communities how to build the very same subterranean greenhouses that had saved him. Sharing the knowledge that had been his inheritance, he was planting seeds of survival, proving with every garden built that his father's final lesson was the most enduring truth of all. That knowledge, when shared with love, is the most resilient and powerful seed in the world.